Welcome everybody to this sessional research event, Bias, Guess and Expert Judgment. Really exciting topic, very interesting, applicable to lots of areas of actuarial work, so I've been really looking forward to it. Before we start, just some brief housekeeping. Please make sure your mobile phones are silent. If the fire alarm does sound, please leave by the nearest fire exit. The staff here will guide you. There'll be questions and answers towards the end of the session. The event is being filmed, so if you do have a question, please can you wait until the microphone comes round so that it's picked up on the tape. As I said, tonight's paper tackles a fascinating area of research that really does have relevance right across actuarial work. It had the distinction of winning the Brian Hay Prize at Gyro 2015. Before I hand over to Ed to introduce the paper, just a quick note on our speakers. On the far end from me, your right, my left, is Ed Tredger. Ed is a fellow of the Institute. He completed a PhD in climate modelling for insurers at the London School of Economics and since worked in the London market for Beazley, UMax and currently at Novi as a senior pricing actuary. He has a strong interest in actuarial research, having given talks at several conferences including R in Insurance, Gyro, LMAG and having chaired the Getting Better Judgement Working Party. Next to Ed, we have Catherine Scullion from Lloyd's. She fell into actuarial work following a natural sciences degree with a focus on genetics. On joining EMB in 2009, she was involved in a wide range of general insurance work across personal and commercial lines. In 2014, Catherine joined the government's actuaries department and managed to infiltrate some familiarity with actuarial work into 17 of the 24 ministerial departments. Following that, she's been at Lloyd's and has taken on the actuarial lead in reporting and strategy. Next to Catherine, we have Sejal. Sejal is a technical specialist in Lloyd's market supervision at the Bank of England. She leads the PRA's response on HM Treasury's initiative to attract insurance-linked securities to the UK and is leading the review of Flood Re's application for authorisation. She's represented the UK in Europe on a broad spectrum of issues, including EU-US dialogue and discussions on catastrophe risk. Prior to joining the PRA, Sejal was with PwC, advising Lloyd's and London market players with a specialism on mergers and acquisitions. And she's been on a number of working parties, spoken on topics including ERM and non-life insurance strategies. Immediately next to me is Joe Lowe. Joe heads the actuarial R&D activities at Aspen, which has taken him into a variety of areas, including actuarial risk and catastrophe risk. He's an enthusiastic supporter of research in the profession and has co-authored several research papers and chaired a number of working parties and is currently serving as a member of the Gyro Committee. I'll hand over to Ed to introduce the paper. Our panel are each going to speak briefly on areas of the topic, and then we'll move on to an extended Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. So as Tim was saying, I'm just going to give a relatively high-level overview of some of the background to the working party and how we kind of what process we went through to come up with the paper which we're presenting tonight. The working party began really in late 2013 with an article we published in the Actuary magazine, catchily titled "Sitting in Judgement." And in that, we tried to kind of raise awareness of the issue of expert judgment and kind of see what kind of issues we could throw out there for the profession to take on. Based on that, we formed a working party And we then conducted a survey with the kindly sponsored by the Institute of Actuaries in order to try and gauge whether this really was an issue which a lot of people across the actual profession were interested in us looking at. We got 220 responses, which I understand is a very good turnout for an institute survey. And needless to say, a lot of people who did respond to that were quite positive about us taking on expert judgment as a subject. We then formed the working party to carry out a literature review, trying to see what work has been done in other fields in the field of expert judgment. We're aware of a few kind of high-profile publications that have come out in recent years, most popularly with Daniel Kahneman's book, which kind of captured public imagination about the propensity for the human mind to make mistakes in all kinds of different situations. Having read some of those literature, we felt that the case studies were quite fascinating in some regards, and we thought about how they could be then taken over to actuarial work and what lessons we could learn. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples from the literature, which I hope will kind of point you in the same direction as our thinking was. So one study was carried out where the respondents were asked what proportion of the UN countries come from African states. The snag is that before being asked the question, they were shown a spin from a roulette wheel. And the roulette wheel was rigged such that it would produce either an answer of 10 or 90. Those people who saw the number 10 gave an answer of 25%. Those people who saw the number of 90 on the roulette wheel gave an answer of 40%. Now, the true answer is somewhere in the middle, but what that demonstrates is that there is what we call anchoring bias, which is that people who even see irrelevant information will somehow be mentally anchored towards a higher or lower level. So we then thought about, well, how do actuaries, claims handlers, underwriters, management, how are they influenced by seeing a set of numbers, either relevant or irrelevant, before then being asked for a key piece of expert judgment? And to give another example, people were asked about whether they were happy to drive 10 miles in order to save $10 on a $40 toy. And the majority of people were happy to make that 25% saving. However, most people were not happy to drive the 10 miles to save $100 on a $10,000 car. Whilst a higher absolute amount, this is obviously much less in proportionality. Much more in proportionality. So this is what we call framing bias, which is the context of the question had a different outcome on people's behaviors, even though they would have been logical to drive, also to make the discount on the car. A third and final example, people asked in studies which is the more common in the English language, words that begin with the letter R or words where the third letter is R. Now, most people would guess that it's words that begin with R, because we can all think of road, ran, ring, rung. There's lots of words that come to mind easily. But of course, the answer is that it's words where R is a third letter are in fact the most common. For, word, car, percent, etc. This is an example of what we call availability bias, which means that things that come more readily to mind achieve a higher probability in the way we see the world. Again, we are thinking about this in terms of actual work. What's the front page news, the high-profile risks? What are people focusing on? And then what are the less available things that people may miss out on? So this literature gave us a kind of a vocabulary as well to talk about these different biases and heuristics, as they're called, and bring that into actuarial work, anchoring, framing, small sample bias, availability bias, substitution bias. We found these quite useful things that you can bring up in a context of work or in our research in order to pinpoint and specify what we mean by these different biases and kind of errors of judgment. So we went on to kind of deep dive into certain, what we thought were key areas of actuarial expert judgment, and armed with this collection of vocabulary and knowledge from other literature, where do these biases come up in actuarial work? Can we pinpoint certain examples of these biases? And then can we find ways that we can potentially do things differently in order to reduce them? So the result of the work through these case studies, through some empirical studies which we've carried out at LMAG, at a capital modelling seminar run by the Institute, at Gyro, and also in-house, is a set of kind of proposals for how we might get better judgment. We don't feel that these are necessarily yet full gold standards. We wouldn't like to necessarily label them that way right now, but we think they're useful ways of thinking about where bias can arise, tools to think about how they might be potentially reduced in general. And we hope that people will, from tonight, sort of take away something about the different biases that exist, and also get a feel for the prevalence of bias within actuarial expert judgment, and how this can really add commercial value to a lot of companies on top of the regulatory angle. So I'm going to pass over to Catherine now, who's going to take you through some of the case studies that we've carried out.
Thanks, Ed. So I do have some slides on the case study. I don't just love a lectern for speaking. So following on from those general remarks about biases in the literature outside of the actuarial context, I'll take us through some of the detail that we've considered when we translated those into the actuarial context. And the working party members have a general insurance background, so that's where our case studies arose from, but we'd be very interested in examples, and particularly any techniques that those from other practice areas have seen to address similar issues, because we feel quite confident that they do arise in most areas of actuarial work. And so in any situation requiring elicitation of an expert judgment, we first of all considered some general principles that would apply before taking those into two particular situations. So I'll start on those general principles which are covered in the paper. And they really all stem from a need to consider some of the more qualitative aspects of the work we get involved with as actuaries. The need to make sure that within those we avoid any sort of trust me, I'm an actuary mentality, and that we acknowledge the uncertainty around some of these areas that we're discussing. So the first aspect that we considered is that of preparation. So that preparation for any discussion that's going to be used to elicit a judgment from an expert is really key. It definitely shouldn't be underestimated as part of the process. That's both in terms of preparing for what approach will be taken, and also looking at what data will be used, what's available, how it can be presented, how it should be used to structure the discussion with the expert. Then moving on to during the discussion, it's very important to manage the potential for any bias with careful structuring of the questioning. That's where the preparation has been key. The case studies will provide a bit more flavour around what we mean by that. And also during the discussion, Ed mentioned Kahneman's book, it's Thinking Fast and Slow. It's key to slow down the thinking of the expert to avoid getting gut feel or instantaneous responses, making sure that there's a clear rationale so that it can be considered carefully to derive the judgment. And part of that is making sure that that aspect is documented. It can be referred to again and checked for consistency with future judgments when that's next required. And so after getting judgment from an expert, then we have thinking around how do we validate that. So both validation of the judgment itself, and there are quantitative ways of doing that most of the time, but also do we need to consider validation of how the judgment was actually elicited, how the discussion took place, how it was documented. And are there other techniques we can use to validate the judgment in that more qualitative way? So can we check the coherence of the judgment by using a different set of questions and check that we get a consistent result? Can we check it against any independent information? And more widely around that, should we have peer review of that process? We typically have peer review of the numbers, but the process itself is often taken for granted, and we need to consider how we could improve on that. And another of the questions we had a few debates in the working party of where does the actuary actually sit in this process? So which part of the actuarial skill set is relevant to doing this and doing it well? So the first case study I'll talk through to illustrate some of those points is one around high-impact, low-probability events. So these are a particular focus for general insurance actuaries, and under Solvency II, the 1 in 200 has become the center of such a focus to a reasonable extent. And so what we're looking for in this question is what the worst outcome in 200 realizations of a situation would be. And it might be something typically that an actuary is discussing with an underwriter for a certain class of business or a certain outcome. And essentially what we're asking for here is quite a difficult question. It's asking for an estimate from a distribution that's beyond what data is available, almost certainly, and requires significant judgment to be applied to something quite technical. So I guess partly to say that this is a simplistic way of asking it, and typically not undertaken, but by looking at it in this context, we can kind of break it down and see how some of the issues may arise. So we can add a little bit of color to do that. So I've highlighted the word "your" in the question. So that makes it quite personal to the expert. And by doing so, you naturally make someone's judgment less subjective. They may become defensive around that. They may also become quite protective. So if they're an underwriter writing for a class of business, they may feel like it is almost their loss, and that will affect the objectivity of their judgment. They may also have over or under confidence given that, or suffer from availability bias. So Ed discussed that, and especially in this context, people tend to live in slightly temporal bubbles. So they'll be able to recall events that they have personally experienced, but they may not look further back or to other areas for equally relevant events to the judgment. And also, the ownership might give them the impression that they should know what you're asking for. So while it's a very challenging question to provide judgment on, if you're asking it to them personally, they may feel more or less likely to acknowledge that the uncertainty associated with that, and more likely to be overconfident. The next word I highlighted is the word loss. So again, the language may cause a bit of defensiveness, although losses are inevitable in insurance. They can still touch a bit of a nerve. And in addition to any emotional response, in this sense, there's also an issue with meaning. So it's a bit ambiguous. Do we mean an aggregate loss over the year? Do we mean a single claim? Do we mean gross or net of any reinsurance? So it's not clear what's being asked for. And if the expert doesn't feel like they can have that easily clarified, they'll jump to their own conclusion. It may not be the one that's actually required by the questioner. So the next word to consider to be of potential difficulty is the word expect. So again, there's some further issues with ambiguity on this. So the questioner might have a particular statistical interpretation in mind, but that might not be how the expert sees it. And the subtlety of the mode and the mean, being the expectation, is quite important in skewed distributions. And if you don't make that clear, then you may not get what you're asking for from the expert. And so the final one then from this question is the 1 in 200. So it's quite a challenging concept, a challenging thing to think through. And to many people, it's not clear whether you want 200 previous years, 200 future years. In most cases, what we want is 200 realizations of the next future year, but that's probably the most difficult of those to picture. It's certainly not the most intuitive way of thinking about it, and that's often the case even with people with quite a lot of statistical training. So in reality, what we're asking here is for quite a remote point. It's really challenging the expert. And in reality, if we asked for the 1 in 100, how different an answer would we get? Because people's minds cut off at a certain level of remoteness, if you like, and then everything beyond that may get grouped into one place. So this is a particularly difficult area of the question to address from a standing start. So in the paper, then, we do discuss ways that we could improve on this. So we've taken a simplistic question, broken it down, and you can see quite quickly that it's a minefield of biases and issues when asking an expert for a judgment. And so as I had said, we've tried to make suggestions to move towards improvements. We're certainly not suggesting that we've solved the issue, but we have offered some ideas to move the reasoning in the right direction. So the first is, as I pointed out, this is really quite a simplistic way of approaching this problem. It would be much better to have a series of questions building up a picture to get to this type of judgment. as I said, the 1 in 200 is very remote. Most people would struggle to immediately get to that point. So building it up from lower percentiles and other aspects of the distribution that are perhaps more familiar would result in a much more coherent judgment that could then potentially be extrapolated to the extremes, where experience is known to be very sparse. And secondary to that, in order to avoid availability bias, so people using their own reference examples, predefined scenarios could be prepared, and that would avoid the experience of the expert dominating their judgment and would slow down their thinking to make them consider these additional scenarios. And then on the validation side, which I touched on as being one of the general principles of trying to reduce these biases, is to play back the answer that they've built up, to allow them to take some considered time to make any improvements to it. And that can also incorporate any independent information. So if there's any existing modelling, particularly around catastrophes, and also reinsurance performance. So if they provide a particular event, you can check how the reinsurance would perform, and that's also makes sense in the context of their judgment. So the second case study we looked at is on parameters for dependency structure, typically in a capital model or another variability model. So in the first case, the question was quite simple to get to, if you like, a point estimate. In this case, we're asking again for something quite complex, most likely subject to even greater uncertainty and even more intuitively difficult for someone without statistical training. And again, this might be something that's discussed between actuaries and underwriters in order to establish which classes of business are expected to be strongly dependent and which are less so in the modelling. So we might be aiming to populate a matrix that looks a bit like this with our various COBs of class of business and how related each one is. We, as a working party, discussed that there's a number of levels to the judgment in this regard. So the dependency structure itself, what form that would take, and also the parameters for how those are correlated. In the paper, we focus on the parameters themselves and how those might be judged, but there's equally issues with the structure as well. So in this case, we probably have even less data and information than we did in the estimation of an extreme scenario, and it's very difficult to use that data to imply strongly supported parameters for dependency. So there's significant judgment involved, and it's quite difficult to validate. Ed touched on anchoring bias. That's a real danger in this case. So the bounds of this are naturally 0 and 1. So the expert might be overly anchored to either one of those, so they'll adjust either upwards from 0 or downwards from 1, and they may not do so in as much as they would if they were just asked to estimate the numbers. And equally to that, because of the uncertainty involved, there might also be strong incentive to anchor to any existing benchmarks or previous exercises because the judgment is so uncertain. Again, as in the previous case, there might be availability bias, where connections seem obvious once they're known. So in the financial crisis, some liability classes deteriorated at the same time, and that's usually now commonly recognized in models, but if those events haven't yet occurred, they may be explored to a much lesser degree. And in this context as well, framing of the questions, it's another area Ed touched on. This has significant technical challenges. So if you want to estimate the dependency based on extremes, you might try to question around if class of business 1 is beyond the 99th percentile, what is the chance that class of business 2 is, or vice versa. And those are technically demanding questions, so the framing would be very important to how the expert responds. And so similarly to the other case, preparation and data would be key if there is any that you could use on this in order to show any potential effects. Again, predefining scenarios where it's discussed how effects could happen rather than relying on the examples that the expert can recall. And also avoiding any kind of anchoring, potentially by not using numerical ratings, but by using some kind of qualitative rating, would improve the possibility of too much anchoring to 0 or 1. And again, the feedback would be very useful to the expert. So once this is input into the model, it will look very different to how it looks on this, and feeding back what that implies about various likelihoods of exceedance across different classes of business could be very informative and allow them to assess their judgment and have more of an understanding of the implications of it. So I'll hand over to Sejal now to discuss a bit more detail on judgment quality, having pointed out all the issues.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, so from the case studies, we have this idea that expert judgment can be of varying qualities. I think this is something we're all aware of, but it's not something that is often explicitly acknowledged. And we've also got the idea that Catherine introduced, that it's actually the elicitation process that can be fundamental to the quality of the end judgment. Now, this is actually really interesting because this is actually nothing to do with the expert. So the aim of our paper was to stimulate debate on this topic and to share some ideas for rethinking, expert judgment. So here we have the concept of the guess universe. So conceptually, expert judgment and guesses are not actually so far apart. Expert judgment on this we can see as a subset of this guess universe. So it is a view formed in the presence of incomplete and often imperfect information. So fundamental questions resulting from this are, how do in fact we distinguish between guesses and expert judgments? How do we avoid getting blinded by experts? And how can non-experts, including boards, properly challenge experts' views and understand any embedded assumptions? And in the paper, we develop this further, and we share some ideas about how we, propose this is tackled. So, for example, we talk about, we often need to seek extra views that are not necessarily in the line of sight of our experts. This isn't coming free, this comes at a price. So we need to weigh up the cost-benefit of doing this. We need to attach credibility to different views. As Catherine has already mentioned, we look for biases in the formation of our judgment and the processes we use. We want to ensure robust group discussions and consider how different views are being amalgamated in order to form a coherent whole. And then also allow for appropriate validation and feedback loops to the extent that this is possible. So this is really good because this allows a way to improve learning and think about refining any prior preconceptions which may or may not be correct. Good. Next, I wanted to touch briefly on groupthink. So groupthink, this is a phrase first coined by the psychologist Irving Jennis in the early 70s. So I think we all intuitively have an understanding, why we engage in group discussions. So the idea is that we'd get different views on the table, mined from different information wells that are present in the company, so some quite deep views, some more shallow views, and amalgamate them and land at what's supposed to be, in theory, a more robust view. And I think we also now have an idea of groupthink and when group discussions actually go wrong. And we discuss some of these features in the paper again. So these are things like when the discussion really isn't actually a discussion, but it's more of a play act. When there's insufficient challenge behind any prevailing view. And then the paper goes on to explore some possible solutions. And it touches on, the fundamental role of the chairing, controlling the group discussions, and making sure alternative views get sufficient airtime. It talks about how discussions are actually structured and how views are presented so that views that may seem to be in a minority get sufficient discussion time. And it also talks about how we try to prevent our natural tendencies towards conflict avoidance. So the idea here is that we don't want to reach a consensus too soon, and we need to sometimes be in the uncomfortable position that we actually allow, an argument to take place between two quite different and conflicting opinions in order to form a more robust view. So in this meeting, I actually wanted to look at successful examples of groupthink and contrast this against how we currently arrive at group judgments and see what we can learn from this. So, this may be the first time in an actuarial lecture where we have a study of ant behavior. I was also considering looking at wildebeest migrations, but we'll focus on the ants. So the question is, how do the ants find a suitable location for their new nest when their colony is destroyed? So in the problem setup, we deal with similar issues to what we encounter in the actuarial sphere. So we've got a deluge of potential information source, and we've got significant cognitive demand placed on a single ant. So how does it deal with all this? How do the ants organize themselves, and how do they not get overwhelmed or paralyzed by different choices? So 2 features to note immediately. Firstly, no single ant is in charge, and secondly, they distribute this task amongst their colony members. So, the ants send out scouts, and these scouts check out potential home sites. And they look for things such as the size of the entrance and how big the cavity is. If the ant likes what it sees, they return to the colony. Then the ant sends out a pheromone message saying, "Follow me." And then another ant joins her and checks out the potential site. Now, if she likes what she sees, she goes back and repeats the process, and it brings in other ants. If she doesn't like what she sees, she just returns to the colony, and it stops. If enough ants like a site, the colony reaches a quorum and chooses the new home. So what are the learning points, the potential learning points from this? So there are some set rules around how the ants arrive at judgments, and these are specified in advance. There's a democracy of opinions. No opinion is given more favorable voting than another at the outset. The process of feedback from the other ants is actually very quick, and they're being judged purely on their results. So if we contrast this to our model, we place more emphasis on experts, so we give quite a lot of weight to experts' opinions. But how do we make sure that these are challenged robustly and we don't reach consensus too early? So an expert may have a pet view, but maybe if we're discussing a tail outcome, we actually need them to think, a broader set of alternatives. So somehow we need to stretch the possibilities available to them. Often we have a much greater time lag between the setting of any judgments we make and the eventual outcomes. But in order to test the quality of our judgment formation, we need to keep a record not only of the decision, but the method at which we arrived at the decision and the information sources it was reliant on. So then we'd be in a better position to see what can be improved next time. Finally, each ant only processes a very small amount of information. So this is really interesting. So the parallel here would be how to reduce unnecessary cognitive demands on any expert so that they're doing just what is in their expertise. And how do we structure the elicitation session so that the facilitator or chairperson can weed out any superfluous information for them. So for example, when the underwriter is trying to form a view, when we ask them, what is your view of the 1 in 200? You know, this is not something they're conceptually used to dealing with on a day-to-day basis. It's outside of their field of expertise. So should we, in fact, be asking them more relevant questions to them and then trying to do the extrapolation? So some thoughts I want to leave you with. There are methods that are more closely aligned to some of the ANT principles that you may want to explore for some of your group discussion scenarios. So one method in particular that we mention, the Delphi method, uses some of these principles. So it introduces the concept of preserving anonymity of opinions. So that's almost forcing, you know, a democratic process in opinion selection. The information flow is processed in a structured way rather than the ad hoc way in which, you know, group discussions can sometimes flow unless they're properly managed. And finally, there's regular feedback of forecasts. So earlier statements can be far easily revised, and there's not the same stickiness in views because people are no longer attached to, you know, certain views. It's anonymized at the outset. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Joe.
Before our concluding comments, it would be useful to say a few words about our work in blending judgment and data. When blending judgment and data to form an answer, more weight is intuitively given to data if data is plentiful, if experience is not volatile, and if judgment is uncertain. We highlighted the Bonhoeffer-Ferguson as an example, in which more weight is given to data for the more mature origin periods, where experience is usually less volatile. Now, in section 9 of our paper, we highlighted the well-established Bayesian theory as a more general framework to help assign weight or credibility. At the coalface, actuaries do not seem to make use of Bayesian credibility formulas often, but rather prefer to judgmentally base and adjust credibility weights on the 3 intuitive principles. Now, laying aside the pros and cons of such practice, an interesting question is how close our judgmental weights are to the Bayesian ones. Now, towards this, an empirical experiment was done at the beginning of one of our presentations. The audience was asked to provide answers individually to a frequency estimation problem, which was expected to lie in the participants' comfort zone, if you like. The results suggested that we are not really natural Bayesians. Indeed, around 60% of the respondents ignored external information totally. Moreover, there was no evidence that estimated weights varied between those with 5 years of data and those with 15 years. Now, we believe training can make a difference. On another occasion, we performed the same test on a different audience, but placing the test in the middle of the presentation, immediately after awareness was raised regarding cognitive heuristics and biases, much as we have seen earlier in the paper or indeed this evening. The 18 responses gave weights statistically closer to those Bayesian theoretical ones. The discussion to this section, section 9, concludes by urging the reader to explore Bayesian approaches more in their work and as an area of research. We highlighted the more objective nature of the framework against the seemingly subjective, judgmental approach to coming up with weights. Using these approaches could give enhanced transparency and better buy-ins. The actuary would, however, need to manage the risk of miscommunication, in which the user of actuarial work imagines that projections are now much more accurate, even if very little data was available. So moving on to section 10 of the paper, judgment is clearly an area of general interest to actuaries. We had an unusually large response to the Working Party survey, 220, whose results we summarized in the appendix of the paper. Now, one of the questions asked for the respondents' opinions as to the most important actuarial activities. Are they to do with making sure that the end user understand your actuarial outputs? Are they to do with technical modeling excellence? Or are they to do with formation, communication, and use of expert judgment? So basically communication or technical modeling excellence or expert judgment. Now, if I could ask for a quick straw poll of tonight's audience. So if you think making sure the end user understand your actuarial output as the most important for your work, would you raise your hand? Right, thank you. And technical modeling excellence? Thank you. And expert judgment? Okay, thank you. I think there's some maybe not so decided amongst the audience, but I guess I can say that a little less than half of the respondents in our 2014 survey thought the most important actuarial activity was making sure the users of actuarial work understood their outputs. Of the remaining respondents, so there was half about communication. Now, for the other half, about half of them thought technical modeling was important, and then the other half thought expert judgment. Perhaps I should have be more mindful of the group think phenomenon before I ask for the quick straw poll. But actuarial research outputs do not really reflect this split from our survey, and possibly from tonight as well, the split we saw tonight. Now, academia is giving us fantastic modeling insight. I love some of the papers in Aston Bulletin and some in Annals of Actuarial Science. I also enjoy reading some of the IFOA Working Party's presentations on communication aspect. But apart from a few passing references here and there in papers and presentations, judgmental topics has yet to make regular appearances in actuarial conferences. Could the paper presented a couple of sessionals ago by our live colleagues, or indeed this one, stimulate a turning point to the profession's research direction? We singled out empirical studies as a good area for research. A bank of evidence would help to construct solid bases on which to base best practice recommendations. Even research in communication could benefit from empirical studies. How might different decisions get made if we communicated our actuarial work differently? What judgmental biases might you get from your experts if you framed questions in different ways? Several specific questions are listed in the paper, and I'm sure you would be able to come up with more this evening. There may, moreover, be opportunities to engage in useful collaborative research with other professions. The formation, communication, and usage of expert judgment are surely also an area of concern for underwriters, claims handlers, and investment officers. Psychologists would help bring insight into the personality angle. Now, many respondents in our 2014 survey said they planned in the next 12 months to, 1, generally talk about the subject in their companies, perhaps informally with their colleagues. 2, read more, attend conferences or workshops about the topic. Facilitate regular sharing sessions of good practice. Now, a few also put down running systematic reviews of judgments in their organizations, actuarial work, and formally incorporate judgmental thinking into peer reviews. Some was contemplating organizing training for actuaries or even for non-actuaries. Produce a checklist for themselves and other colleagues, so perhaps a poster that you can stick around your department. There was even one individual who said they would think about organizing an internal exam for their students as part of their study requirements. Now, if you were one of these respondents, how did you get on with your plan? More generally, for everyone this evening, how do you see yourselves doing things differently in the next 12 months? How should actuaries collectively help one another to get better judgment?
Thank you, Joe. We'll now move on to questions and viewpoints from the floor. Can I have a quick show of hands who's immediately got something to offer? One down here at the front, and one over on the far side, and one at the back. Can I just ask everybody to remember to wait for the microphone to come round, so that we make sure we pick it up on the tape? Where is the microphone? At the back. Do you want to come down and take the question from the front first, please?
John Spain, knowing nothing about GI, I hesitate to say anything, but this is a great paper, well presented, and I'm grateful because you've given us some stuff to think about, particularly groupthink, which is a real problem in the pensions area, a real problem, so I'm grateful. So can I just pick up 2 points that Sejal mentioned, and perhaps slightly disagree? You said, I think, that no ant had any more of a vote, any more power than any other ant. I think actually the earlier ants did have more influence than the others, because once you had a critical mass, everybody else was following, and I think that's what you get with groupthink all the way. Secondly, in terms of discussions, recording discussions, what's really important perhaps is not only to record what the decision was and the mechanisms used to arrive at that decision, but most important, to record what else was considered discarded and why those things were discarded, so people can come back and say, we told you so.
Thank you. Sejal, do you have anything to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, the second point, I would agree with you. It's very important to also, have a consideration and, as you indeed point out, a documentation of why certain alternatives were discarded. And in the light of, perfect foresight, then perhaps you can say, actually, the reasons for discarding those alternatives may not bear out in the future. So I think that also actually provides a very good learning opportunity. So thank you, I would agree with that. In terms of the ant example, yes, again there you are absolutely right. Once a certain critical mass builds up, then all the rest of the ants follow, and they don't. The point there, though, is that the initial ants going about their foray, no one ant is in a more privileged situation than any other ant, and that can be very different to group discussions. So when your boss is in the room, how many discussions have we seen where the miners tend to follow the boss's opinion, even when they actually have a different view entering that room? So there are situations where, once a certain decision has been reached, so long as it's been reached in a robust fashion, then the discussion is closed down. So in the ant example, once a certain quorum has been reached, it's not beneficial for further ants to do that investigation and tackle that same question. But, this is more about how do we get to that robust outcome in the first place. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Move over to the far side now. Thank you.
Good evening, my name is Andrew Smith. I'd also like to add my thanks to the authors for this very stimulating paper. I'm going to pick up on a point that is raised just once in this paper on page 20, which is about the need for long-term testing. And I know that Sejal, you did say a bit more about feedback, and Joe, you also mentioned about the need for empirical studies. It seems to me that in the GI space, we've got probably tens of thousands of data points of historic expert judgments, which are the published ultimate losses for tens of thousands of combinations of company, line of business, underwriting year, year of filing in the PRA returns, and before that the FSA returns, and before that the DTI returns. Now, analysing that data is tricky because it's a bit messy and companies merge and contracts get reclassified, but the data in principle is there, so we've got a very large number of judgments we could analyse. Also there, of course, is the underlying claim payments and incurred data from which you could construct mechanical estimates of ultimates using a chain ladder method or something like that. And for lines of business that maybe are written more than 5 years ago, you could sensibly ask which of those, the mechanical method or the judgment method, which of those is closer to the actual outturn. So that work could in principle be done. To my knowledge, it hasn't been done, or at least the results haven't been published, and a few calculations that I did suggested that we might not get the answer we're looking for, and that it might not, on a purely statistical basis, vindicate the use of expert judgment. So what is it doing instead? Well, it's serving some other objectives. So, for example, the use of expert judgment may be smoothing the emergence of profit. The use of expert judgment by reducing volatility may be mitigating capital requirements. So it seems to me that in those cases, the discussion we need to have is what purpose is being served by that judgment, and are those purposes also legitimate? So to conclude, I'd like to encourage the authors, or indeed somebody else, to do the analysis of the judgments that are out there. We're making a few speculations about properties of judgments that could be either verified or alternatively refuted with respect to evidence, and it would be nice to see the evidence. I'm not going to take that any further. I'm certainly not going to dispute your entomology, Sejal.
I noticed you neatly sidestepped volunteering to do the analysis yourself.
I'm one of you other working parties right now.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point, particularly around other purposes for judgment other than purely trying to improve our estimate of the truth. I don't know whether, Ed, do you have anything to come in on that?
Well, yeah, I think it is an interesting question. Your point about the purpose of what judgment's trying to get at is quite an interesting one. I mean, I think that there's certainly so can be negative ways of using judgment to, for example, as you're saying, to try and distort financial results for some kind of gain to reduce capital or whatever. It's worth noting that I think that you can also, once you understand the way that expert judgment works, the way bias works, you can slightly use it to your advantage. You can introduce a positive anchoring. For example, if you know that someone is going to have a tendency to understate their reserves, you know, you spin a roulette wheel and give them a high result before you talk to them and hope that it pushes them up. Or you can use ways of kind of guiding that, and even some simple things about how you should, you know, frame things, to how you frame the question to people. If you know beforehand there's going to be a bias there, you can almost preempt that and try and cancel it out with something else. So yeah, I think it can be a useful thing just to be aware of that dynamic and kind of be armed with the tools to be aware and mitigate as you go through the world of expert judgment.
I think that also comes back to the first question on documentation and some of the aspects highlighted in the case studies as well. So in addition to making sure you document what wasn't considered or what was disregarded, the reasons underlying your judgment should also be, and then looking back at those, which aspect was flawed, or was there something else being incorporated in your judgment as you suggest, and then being able to look at it at that level will help draw that out.
And I think there is a deeper point here, which, you know, we don't explore in the paper, but is around some of the incentivization of the experts forming the judgment, or the questions that the experts are actually being asked to address. So I would say, Andrew, in your valid example, I don't think the question they were targeting was, will my loss ratio hold up in 10 years' time? It was more, what can I live with next year, and what is the appropriate communication to the market. So I think in any analysis we do of any backwards judgments, we need to be conscious of how that incentivisation was working.
Thank you. Anything else from the floor on that topic before we move to the question at the back? Can I ask for the microphone to go to the back, please?
Malcolm Sleep. Thanks for that paper. I also thought it was very thoughtful and a good presentation. So my background is life, but I also agree that very much sort of applies a lot within life. It's not just GI, it's obviously going to be in pensions. I was just going to pick up on a few points. I mean, one bit in the paper, it talks about expert judgment as being the method of last resort. And I think I would disagree with that, in that you could say, surely the big selling point of us actuaries is we provide value, the added value, by being able to make a judgment, to analyse things and provide the extra bit of judgment. It's not just turn the sausage machine and out comes the answer at the end of it. It's the fact we can explain it and provide that extra bit of commentary, which sort of stands us out maybe from the crowd. You also talked about bias quite a bit, and yeah, I sort of, we definitely do need to avoid that. My daughter did buy me the book for Christmas, which was How Not to Be Wrong, The Hidden Maths of Everyday Life, which very much talks about you can very easily think you see a pattern in something, and that pattern doesn't exist. It's just a bit of random noise, but you can so easily believe this is what's happening, and we need to be aware of that in what we're doing. Just one comment on groupthink. I think what can happen if you're not careful is, even if you get together a panel of experts or experts on those of the wider knowledge, they might all have the same background and the same experience. So although they're debating it, they're debating from a very narrow pool of knowledge. You need to make sure, have you got somebody else who can provide some different perspective? I mean, in some ways, that's why it helps to have sort of a turnover of staff within a company, and not just have a company where everybody's been working there for 20 years. If you've got people coming in who've worked elsewhere, they've got different experience, and they can build that into your group think. And my final comment was on training. You talked about training, what training is necessary, and that led to the thought, well, is that technical training, or is it professional skills training? And the answer is it's probably a bit of both. I mean, the Actuaries Code talks about competence and care, and it talks about communication. There's no reference as to judgment within the Actuaries Code, and maybe they should be. I know it's up for review in the coming months, and maybe that's one of the things they should be looking at. But overall, yes, it was a very good paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So a number of things to pick up on there, the kind of value of an actuary and what we add to the process, and how important it is to be aware of what might skew our judgment, a point on diversity and a point on training and how we incorporate these sorts of ideas into the Actuaries Code. Do you want to start, Ed? Some thoughts?
Just to come back on your first point, I think it's actually a really interesting question, which is you're saying that actuaries are valued for the expert judgment they can overlay on top of the technical skills, which I would certainly agree with, because in the area which I watch as GI London market, there's intensive use of expert judgment, both by non-actuaries and by actuaries, and that is critical to the work. I think there are actuaries, perhaps more so in America than in the UK, who would see actuaries' value as in providing the quantitative side, the analysis, and not being as involved in overlaying the expert judgment side. So I think the expert judgment is really critical for us, but I'm not sure that every actuary would necessarily see that as a key part of their work. I think a lot of actuaries will come at their profession from a background where you've done maths, done statistics, you've done your sciences, there's an answer. You do exams, there's an answer. You're trained up to be very good at producing the numbers, and you can go through a quarter of a century of education of being told this is how you turn a handle effectively to produce the right answer from a formula or from a set of numbers, and you're never really once asked, but what do you think? You know, what do you think about that equation? It doesn't come up in our training. So I guess that kind of feeds into your last point, really, which is it can be a little bit, it can be a certain bias in terms of the people who become actuaries tend to go into things because they're interested in initially the technical side, and then later found they have to provide the judgments. So I do wonder how well equipped everyone is to deal with that side of the real world once we come out of the education mill.
Any thoughts on that from the floor? Should expert judgment be part of an actuary's role, or should we confine ourselves to applying actuarial methods where there's sufficient credible data? In the words of a former colleague of mine from across the pond, should we be silent where the data is silent?
Martin White, I'll try and give a slight answer to that. Generally, on the value of actuarial judgment, I'd say where it has most value, it's based on a deep understanding of the business area concerned. So, for example, life insurance and pensions, we may be the one class of people who have a decent idea across the entire business how it works. But I think we must be extremely careful to recognize that for some of the most important assumptions of all, such as future investment returns and inflation, we really haven't got a clue.
Thank you. Any more thoughts on that? Did somebody want to tackle the diversity question and how we might ensure that where it's helpful to have a group of people opining on something, we can make sure we genuinely hear different opinions. Any thoughts from the panel?
Yeah.
Sejal?
Yeah. So diversity, again, completely agree with this. And I think our paper does allude to this. So it's not only, professionals within the insurance space. So, for example, where we're developing 1 in 200s, I think this is outside. I mean, let's face it, insurance professionals aren't very imaginative people. And if we're trying to come up with a 1 in 200, we actually do need to imagine completely new scenarios, completely new things that, haven't happened yet, but what could come to pass. So it's, things like, can we see parallels in other professions? Can we see parallels in other industries that we could adapt and, make insurance examples from? And this, I think, feeds into the first point, the question raised, which was around how are actuaries adding value to this process. So, I feel that a lot of actuaries do feel expert judgment is the method of last resort because they're much more comfortable dealing with the data sets they have. It's not clear to them how they enmesh, qualitative judgments or qualitative aspects into their, ordered statistical view of the world. And that was the angle we were trying to get at. So, Ed mentioned the example of the American actuary. They're traditionally very, very keen on their data to the extent that, they don't want to overlay any expert judgment at all, because inevitably any expert judgment you overlay will be wrong. So it's getting into more of a mindset around thinking around not just what data sets do we have access to, but are these data sets actually relevant for the problem under consideration? What other things should we be bringing to the table? There's a lot that could be done here.
Thank you. Joe, did you have any thoughts on the sort of training and actuaries code and how we might change the way we view this as a profession?
Yeah, I think I very much agree with the comments made by the gentleman there. I might even go into a little bit more detail. Potentially a training program might include some kind of facilitation training, facilitation of judgmental elicitations. I guess then that comes a little bit, there's a step back that we might need to think about as well. There have been kind of a flurry of big data discussion in the recent few years, and some actuaries start to ponder whether we should now think about attracting computer scientists to the profession, as well as mathematicians or people who are relatively numerate. Now, I'm wondering whether we should also try and attract psychologists. I think it will be wonderful to have psychological input. And then, if I then take another step back, in order to attract psychologists to come to our field, we might also need to demonstrate that we are serious about it. And one way to demonstrate that might be through research. I don't know what excites you when you get things through the post. I mean, nowadays we really just get bills and statements really in the emailing world. Even the Annals of Actuarial Science or Aston Bulletin, they are now on electronic form. But I do get excited by the actuarial journals. Earlier this year, as a kind of a Christmas present, I also get another journal. It's called International Journal of Forecasting. Now, these are peer-reviewed journal. The journal contains peer-reviewed papers. Some of them are very technical, about time series analysis. It's really very technical. And you might compare that to kind of your usual Aston Bulletin or even Annals of Actuarial Science kind of paper. But I was relatively excited about a peer-reviewed paper on herding behavior in business cycle forecasting. When Andrew was mentioning about studies, empirical studies, his proposal there would consist of painstaking work of organizing the data, analyzing it. And I think this is a totally worthwhile subject to think about. There will be some psychological input into that. And also, we can consider, we talk about reserving cycle quite a lot in our IFOA working parties. But I think there's a lot more studies that can go into it. I think it's worthy of actuarial science PhD program. And there are a few others. Other paper, for example, we were mentioning, should we go from a lower return period into 1 in 200? A paper was thinking about, how about the other way around? If we go to more extreme return periods and work backwards? What is the totally, absolutely maximum loss that you can think of? And then the practice might be double that, and then come back to it. So there are various different ways. Research will be fascinating. And when psychological students, graduates, etc., see that we also are very interested in that, we will attract more different types of expert, and hopefully will be a more exciting profession as a result.
Any comments on that from the floor? Yep, at the front here.
It's Michael Tripp. Thank you for a fascinating paper and discussion. This is really thinking aloud, because I suppose at the moment within the student faculty is a lot of conversation about the future of our profession and what it is that makes an actuary an actuary. I guess whichever way we skin the cat, we are not a diverse group of people for discussion. That the real challenge is what makes our expert judgment in the fields appropriate. I mean, Martin referred to the fact that we're not very good at predicting investment returns. So one area of judgment that actuaries might be involved in is to do with investment and asset management, isn't it? But we've never really succeeded in that space. And if you talk to an investment expert, I think they would really poo-poo actuaries when it comes to giving any guidance at all on stock selection, sector selection, strategy, and all the rest of it. So, but nevertheless, we've got investment exams. Maybe we should just drop investment exams. Discuss. Another area of expert judgment is maybe in life and pensions when it comes to talking about longevity. And there's, you know, as you can see, the investment thing is slightly left field. Longevity becomes much closer. And if you think about everything you've talked about and you applied that to longevity as opposed to picking ultimate loss ratios, you know, what would the thinking change? How could you help a pensions actuary get beyond, I don't know, the age of 88 as the ultimate age that people are on average going to die at or whatever? And I certainly can remember in previous existences talking with pensions actuaries about longevity and whatever you say you're going to get it wrong. But I guess that's where it brings to me to the thought. I put my hand up and it came to, I think the most important thing is communicating the thinking behind what we're saying so you can help non-experts, for want of a better word, make their own judgments. And that in some sense is the safety net. You know, both in that investment area, the more you can communicate about your thinking and why, it'll help people make better judgments. That longevity area, the more you can communicate about the thinking and why. And I'm sort of thinking aloud a bit, but the real question I'd be interested to get from you, and it's sort of coming out, is what do you think makes an actuary when it comes to this space?
Okay, so actuaries are better on death than money. Who wants to chime in on that?
One thought relating to our paper, we touched on this point of when you're in a very, very difficult situation of expert judgment, it's very important to acknowledge the uncertainties that are there. And perhaps even the Bayesian framework can actually give us a hand there, because in the Bayesian framework, we're not only taking what data we have, weighting that with the expert judgment, but we're also implicitly putting some kind of uncertainty around those parameters which we put in. So if we're in a situation where all we can do is expert judgment on longevity, that's pretty much that's what we have, then if we know we're uncertain, we should then put larger uncertainty within the hyperparameters of our distributions, explore the different alternatives. And that gives us a mechanism for building in some kind of allowance for the uncertainty in the judgment, rather than simply saying we have the right point estimate, or there are a variety of different point estimates that can be explored. So I think that part of a good expert judgment is also knowing how sure you are of it. And that's why we identify small sample bias and overconfidence bias, which is we need to also say, you know, I don't really know what the answer is, but I reckon it's going to be 2.5% per annum with this distribution around it. And if you know that's the best you can get to, at least you've built in some allowance for the uncertainty, and that should somehow be reflected in the result. So I suppose the answer, your question was really what makes an actuary an actuary. I mean, I suppose that we have the ability to draw on different statistical skills to be able to analyse the data, get what we can out of that. Once we've exhausted that, we can look at the judgment, we can blend that, we can build in uncertainty, acknowledge the uncertainties, produce our estimates, and then communicate back what those uncertainties are to say, we've done all this work, this is the process, but the three key assumptions are ABC. So I think there's that joining up of the qualitative and quantitative.
Thank you.
So I think as well it kind of comes back to some of the other discussion around what is the role of the actuary, what training is needed to make that actually be the case in practice. And one of the things that we found when we're doing the literature review was that in other fields there can be a much more structured process for getting judgment from experts, and it actually involves a number of different individuals with different skill sets. So there's the technical, there's also the facilitative, psychological. And some of Joe's points then drew on what role should and does the actuary play, and are we too limited in focusing on the technical side, and do we need to expand that?
Thank you. Gentleman here at the front.
Trevor Lanhorn. Firstly, this is a great paper. I think everybody has said the same, and I'm adding to that chorus. It's a brilliant paper, well done. I think, although it's specific to GI, it's much wider than GI. I think I would urge people in GI, and then potentially if there's an equivalent for the other specialisms, there is a really important need to follow what you're saying in the paper. And let me expand from that into what do we mean by judgment? Because I'm not sure I'm going to be quite in the same place as others on this. And maybe that's because of, what do you call it? What are your biases? Maybe I'm biased. List a few biases. But I've spoken to a number of the math professors who are all Bayesian these days. I've started reading a book by Susskind and Susskind, which I don't know if, has anyone read Susskind and Susskind? Not one. That's effective. Well, actually, that's a surprise because they did speak to Simon Khan and Ashok Gupta and maybe some more other well-known actuaries to get some feedback on it before they wrote it. But effectively, they're saying all professions are in decline. And will any profession exist in 50 years' time? So I pose that as a rhetorical question, which we don't know. But they give reasons for trends going on, and you can sort of see why. And one of them is to do with professions having been fundamentally about judgment in the past, and judgment is getting overtaken by technology and algorithms. And unless professionals do the sorts of things you're saying, which is to make sure you get rid of your biases, whether it's using Bayesian credibility work or something else, unless you do that, you're going to come up with answers which aren't as good as the algorithms are going to give you. And if your answers aren't as good, then it doesn't matter how well you communicate it. There will be others in the market who can see that they can make some money out of it. And effectively, that is seriously an issue. In fact, I'm carrying on the basis that you didn't have too many people with their hands up, but I bumped into Gus O'Donnell the other day, who was the Cabinet Secretary in government for 5 or 6 years. And as he always does when he sees me, he reminds me of what he will call the mess that actuaries got into over longevity. So even what you were saying, Tom, is your rhetorical question. There's others out there who think differently. And if we are not perceived as getting the technical piece right and good enough and without bias, I don't think it matters how well we communicate it. We've got an issue. So on your question, by the way, I would have put my hands up to both the first two as equal, rather than saying one is more important than another. But if you look at this long-term issue, if you've got any doubts, look at what's going on with medicine, where I've read stuff which says that the algorithms available now will give better diagnoses than a typical GP. And it doesn't matter how well the GP communicates it. What about audit? There are people saying audit is going to be totally automated. So is there a profession of audit? And I think long-term, it's absolutely critical for us as actuaries to position ourselves as getting it right in exactly the sorts of ways you're talking about. So that's why I think your paper is brilliant, because if we don't, we are seriously prejudicing the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a few other viewpoints on that.
It's Martin White again. In response really to a point made by Sejal, I think we should mention the impact of professional and legal risk. Sejal mentioned some actuaries may be reluctant to exercise judgment at all and mentioned the US as an example. I think fear of litigation may be at the root of quite quite a few things. If we look at the way in which international accounting standards developed, with rules emphasized over judgment and theoretical accuracy as opposed to prudence, what happened was we had a rule that is now, I think they admit, is discredited for recognizing asset impairment. You weren't allowed to make judgments, so you could only recognize an asset impairment if the asset was going wrong. That meant the concept of IBNR, what's going to go wrong in regard to the rest, is completely ignored, and by definition, the accounts are all deeply imprudent. And when this rule came in, introducing the incurred loss provision in the early 2000s, banks suddenly became profitable, and we know what happened soon after that. So the accounting bodies are now having to change, reluctantly, to a new regime, which is called the expected loss regime. It's completely disgraceful. And we have to be careful as a profession not to allow ourselves to be biased by incentives and things. On Michael Tripp's point about investment, though, it occurred to me as the presentation was being given, once again, I think it was a fabulous paper, that the ways in which you were describing people should think about making judgment is exactly how you should go about investment analysis.
Ed?
I just wanted to come back on a couple of points that have been raised, which is about big data algorithms. Does that mean the end of professions? Is this the end for actuaries? And a couple of observations immediately sprang to mind. One was an actuary was infamously subject to a lot of attack in the press following the 2008 financial crisis because he came up with an algorithm which people claimed bankrupted Freddie Mac and Freddie May because they assumed that things were normally distributed and they're copula. So I think that there are cautionary tales of where having no expert, or rather no common sense, can actually lead us far wrong. The other point about the long term of the profession, I think that in summary, we do know some things from the data. We're not saying we don't. We're not saying we don't have algorithms or methods, because we do. The problem is how to extrapolate from what you do know to what you don't know. And it reminds me of a quote from Duke of Wellington, where he was referring to, he was saying that, I mean, war, a lot like life in general, revolves around trying to take what you do know and apply it to what you don't know. What's over the next hill? And that was his problem, and he saw that as, a problem in life in general, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, what do we know? What can we see over the next hill? We're not going to come up with an algorithm that solves that. It has to involve a certain amount of psychology, a certain amount of group consensus, So I think the algorithms are our friends as long as we use them commonsensically.
Thank you. There was a viewpoint from just behind Martin.
Thank you. David Simmons. One term that's been frequently used in this discussion and in the paper in many other areas is the phrase expert judgment, and it's a term that has troubled me because who are the experts? To my mind, many actuaries and many people in other professions, in order to do the job that they do, in order to provide the service that their clients want, need to make judgments about items which are highly uncertain. And that's the key of the job. Now, in order to manage and mitigate that uncertainty, yes, you need to bring in what expertise are available to you. And yes, you use some of the very interesting techniques that have been mentioned in the paper. But depending on the actuary's job, and there is a big variety. I think we are a fairly diverse, not that, but I think we are more diverse than some might think in order to do the job. So we do a variety of jobs, and some of us in this profession will need to make more judgments about uncertain things than others. And I would say that this paper is very much aimed at them and the wider audience. But I would like us to be thinking about how we can make judgments of things that are highly uncertain and actually have that as our focus. And the expert or the expertise is one of the tools to actually do that job.
Front row. Thank you.
John Spain again. Just picking up on Ed's point about looking at what we can see and then guessing what's over the hill. The trouble is, sometimes what we're looking at, we're not seeing. We don't recognise what's there. We don't recognise what is not there. 2008, perfect example. Looking at assets at market for long-term entities, another example. We cannot see what is there. We cannot see what is not there. We should not kid ourselves that we project things into the future and we can tell people what's going to happen, because we cannot. We can only just give them some idea of what might happen and which way to hedge their bets and hope we might get it right. The other thing is, I can't actually recall seeing the word arrogance in here. It might be there, but I can think of one very senior pensions actuary about 15 years ago who told me quite confidently that one piece of pensions tax legislation had been repealed by something completely different. He was utterly wrong, but he said it with such complete confidence, a couple of people started believing him, which would not have been good.
So yeah, I think, two very valid points have been raised. Big data, yes, we do have competition from big data, but, how much of it is information and how much of it is noise? So can we separate signal from noise? This is where I see where actuaries could add significant value if we do things properly. So, we are familiar with the concepts of judgment. This is something that, big data is only starting to get their hands around. We can steal a march here. And then the second point around, I think there is a genuine point about humility. So whenever we look at something, inevitably we'll have a prior preconception of how we expect things to work. But we need to be sufficiently able to react, to change our mind, and not to view that, in a negative sense. So to be adaptable to and recognise what we are actually seeing. So I think, two very good points.
Andrew Newman. In the interests of diversity and against groupthink and anchoring, I really ought to say that this paper's rubbish, even though I believe it's really excellent. But I think all views, diverse views, ought to be represented. So there we go. And regarding the predictions of Susskind and Susskind that all professions are going by the board, I know that people have been saying about actuaries ever since I started, which is a little while back now, that aren't you going to be, once you've got computers, what do you need actuaries for? People have been saying it for years. What happens is that the actuaries then use the computers, and I think the same is going to be true of the algorithms. The actuaries will use the algorithms, and I think, as people have said before, know when to overlay that with expert judgment, dare I say, and communicate the results. I don't think if we stick our heads in the sand and ignore them, then they might well do us in. But if we embrace them, which I think is the currently accepted political term, if we embrace them, then I think the future's bright.
Thank you. We're in danger of running into time for the drinks. So before we close this part of this evening, any final thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, I guess just coming back on that point, I completely agree, and I think the discussion that big data might overtake things, when actually we could see this as an opportunity, this type of subject area, as we get more data and greater ability to use that. And if we overlay this aspect as well, then that's actually quite a significant advantage.
So I'm sure discussions will continue on afterwards. Please do stay for a glass of something and continue those discussions. I'll end by thanking everybody from the floor for your contributions, your thoughts and your questions, and thank you very much to the panel.